Hello, and welcome to our week 3 in our study of For Such a Time as This. I'm joining you today from my back porch, and I decided to come back here because there have been, over the past 40 years, some really good conversations with God that took place on this back porch. And so I thought, I think I'll go outside. And I think I will talk to my friends from the back porch. So welcome. Welcome wherever you are, whatever city you're in your house. Welcome. And let's talk together. My first question for today and for this week is, do you like to get surprise phone calls? Things you weren't expecting, things that surprise you. My first response is, absolutely I do. I love it. Did you know, just last week, I got a phone call that I was not expecting. It was from my college roommate of a few years ago. We talked, and did you know the years just melted away? It was so fun. I loved it. Oh, wait a minute. Do I like surprise phone calls? No, I do not. If you're a mother and have children who are teenagers or who are grown and on their own, you do not like middle of the night phone calls. I remember many years ago, middle of the night in February, got a phone call saying that my dad's little airplane had crashed and he was gone. Just like that. No, I don't like surprise calls. Have you ever gotten a phone call that just sent joy surging through your body? How I wish we could sit at a table together. I would love to hear the story. And have you ever received one of those phone calls that forever altered life in an instant? I actually would like to hear those stories as well. Because you know, that is the stuff of life. The highs and the lows. The surprises that bring joy and the surprises that change our lives and that bring struggle. That's the way life is here between the two trees. That was the first thing we talked about in our study for such a time as this. We talked about what it means to live between the two trees. What two trees? Well, the first tree is the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, Genesis, perfection. And the second tree is the tree of life in the paradise of God, Revelation, perfection. And we navigate this time and space between. That's where the challenges come. And then in our second week of study, we looked at the question of identity. Who are you? Who am I really? Because you know, the question of identity anchors everything. The question of identity drives what you do, the way you react mentally. So the question of identity is critical. We talked about that. Now today, for week 3, we're going to focus on this idea of being called. Right now, in our time, in our land, in our country, and in our cities, so many things have been put on hold. So many businesses have been closed temporarily. And if we're not careful, we might begin to think that everything is closed, that everything is put on hold. If you're not doing your work right now, there's a temptation to think that perhaps all work is stopped. And that's just not so. There is a call on the life of a believer. There is a call that is placed on you. You know, a lot of the time when we hear the word calling, It's very common in Christian vernacular. I actually don't know if it is as common outside of those circles or not. But within Christian circles, it's common language to say, well, I have been called to this, and it's usually some particular task. Perhaps I have been called into ministry, or I've been called into teaching. I know that God's called me to teach little children or teenagers. Anytime we say God has called me into a role or a task or a job or a city, a place of employment, into a relationship, into a conversation, what we're saying is that we feel impressed in our spirit that God would have us do this thing. And that's good use of the language. Biblical account uses that quite often when God places a task on a particular individual, a person to do a particular job. He's called to that job. That's good use of the language. But I have a little personal confession to make right here. I struggle sometimes differentiating between when it is truly God impressing on me and when it is something that I just really, really want to do. Can't they be the same? Absolutely they can be the same. Are they always the same? No, not always. And so I think we have to be very astute and careful as we use that language. But now, that being said, there is a universal calling on the life of a believer that comes when that person accepts Christ as Lord and unites himself and herself with Christ through baptism. Death to self, life to Christ. When that happens, God makes a phone call. And it is so surprising, it leaves us stunned. God has called you. And that call does not close up in the moment of crisis or in a time such as this. It does not stop. It does not go on hold. And we cannot say, well, temporarily, I can't respond to that. When times change, then perhaps I'll get back to it. We can't do that. Not to this call, the call of God on your life and on mine. What is it? What is it exactly that we're talking about? We're not talking about giftedness. We're not talking about talents or opportunities. This is universal. Very often, the individual ministries we get called into are because of things that He's placed within us. Different gifts from the Spirit that He gives us, or talents that we have been given. And then we work through those things. But this call that I'm talking about is universal, and it doesn't depend on place, and it doesn't depend on style. And it doesn't depend on your particular gifts. It is to you, believer. Well, what is it? What is this call? It's a good question. Let's find it. First of all, let's go to Scripture. First of all, I'm going to go to 2 Timothy chapter 1. You know, Timothy is that letter. It's a little small letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to his son in the faith. His son in the faith, Timothy. And he writes to him and says this in verse 9. Listen to these words. He says, we also know, wait a minute, I'm in 1 Timothy, that won't do. If you have trouble, being outside means that I've got a little breeze blowing my pages. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, listen to Paul. He's talking about not being ashamed of the gospel. And then he says this. He says, by the power of God, who has saved us and called us with a holy calling, not because of anything we've done, but because of his own purpose and grace. Do you hear it? Did you hear it? We have a holy calling. A holy calling. All right? Turn with me now to the book of Hebrews. And in the book of Hebrews, the writer of that letter says this to believers. He says, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1. He says, therefore, brothers and sisters, holy partners in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus. And then he goes on about his message. Do you hear it again? Partners in a heavenly calling. A holy calling, a heavenly calling, but what is it? It has to be more than a particular ministry, don't you think? So what is it? We keep searching. Let's go to the book of Romans. I'm going to take us to a passage that is very familiar. In fact, I'm going to Romans chapter 8. This is a passage that we love. We particularly love it in times such as these. It's important to us to hear it, and it's important to us to hear it again, but I want us to see a phrase in there that sometimes we overlook. Romans 8. I'm going to look at verses 28 and 29. Verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. There's that call again. Called according to his purpose. What is that purpose? That's what we're searching for. 29. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness or the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Do you see it? Do you know what the call on your life is and the call on my life? My friends, the call on our life is to become the image of Christ. You talk about a surprise. You talk about something stunning. I know me. This roommate that called me last week, she knows me too. I know me. The image of Christ. You know, becoming is so much deeper than doing. Doing is important. Oh, it's important. But our doing has to come out of our being. Sometimes we get that reversed. When we understand our being, then we can do. And our doing is so much stronger and more powerful. Besides that, my doings actually may be different from your doings because we are different people. We are living in different places and different circumstances and different life spots. So your doings and my doings are going to look different, but they come from the same place of being. And that place of being is the image of Christ. Becoming the image of Christ in all places, in all jobs, in all ministry opportunities, in all circumstances, even in the middle of a pandemic of worldwide proportion that has placed you at home, the call is not off. The call is on. Remember, the goal of the Christian life is not heaven. That's the reward. And it is a breathtaking reward, is it not? The goal of the Christian life is to become the image of Christ. The goal of a Christian's life is to reflect the life of Christ in your very skin. In other words, it's saying, what would Jesus look like if he put on my skin and lived in my circumstances? And you must ask yourself the same. What would he be like? That's what I'm to reflect. That's what I am to do, because that who is I am to be right now, April 2020. How would Christ live where you are right now? How would he be? Of course, that means I have to know him. I have to be ever growing in my knowledge, which has to do with my union with him. That's why the Hebrews writer again in chapter 12, verse 2 says, fix your eyes on Jesus. That's where your focus has to be, because you have to know him. I want to share a few things with you today for your reflection through the week that I think are critical pieces of this journey to becoming. It's more like a marathon. It's not any sprint. I mean, we're in for the long haul. And it is slow, steady work. That's the call on the life of a believer. So I have 5 things for you. Number 1, the first thing I would suggest to you is we have to simplify our lives. That's one of those things that's so easy to say and is so incredibly difficult to do. We have to simplify life. We have to quit carrying stuff that we don't have to carry. Have you ever watched a marathon race? I know some people who have run marathons. I personally have not. I don't want to. But people who do, did you know I've never seen a marathon runner run with a pack on their back? They don't want any extra weight. It messes them up. It makes the run harder. They don't carry packs. Our Hebrews writer, again in that chapter 12 passage, says this. He says, you have to lay aside every weight that encumbers. He says you have to lay aside every sin that entangles so you can run with perseverance. You know, we have been forced to simplify a lot of things in our lives right now. And here's my question and what I'm wondering. When we get through this, and get through it we will, when we get through it, I wonder if some of the things that made our lives so frantic could be left down. Perhaps we don't need to pick them all back up again. And then also, we have some time right now to take moral inventory. Are there some habits and some patterns that you really know are not like Jesus? Which means you really know that you need to do the hard work of overcoming. Lay aside every burden. Can you, with me, honestly, pray the words of Psalm 139? I'm not talking about just a verse for the day, read the verse and don't think about it again. I'm not talking about some kind of religious liturgy at this particular point. I'm talking about you on your knees before God, crying out to him, oh God, search me and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me. And then show it to me. Now, I give you a warning. It's not a pretty sight. And in my experience, when you honestly pray that prayer, he will show you. And then it's in your lap to deal with or not. God show us our own hearts and our own minds. Test us. We're being tested right now. Test us. That prayer, my friends, takes a tremendous amount of courage. Pray it. Pray it. Number 2. Second thing I would tell you that I believe is important in the becoming is daily focus. It's like training. Transformation is. It's like training. You ask any athlete, I really want to be expert at this particular sport, but I don't have time to train. So what are the shortcuts that you have learned? Or ask any musician. Oh, I long to be proficient at cello. I love that instrument. I don't have time to practice every day. What are some shortcuts? We think transformation into the image of Christ, that there are shortcuts? We're going to check in on a Sunday morning service and then check out when we leave the door? The call on us, my friends, is transformation daily. It's those other 6 days a week, no, 6.5 days a week, where the testing comes, the training. Let me tell you something. If you need a fun activity to do right now because you're a little bit bored, go onto your Google Drive or whatever search engine you use and research people who look like their dogs. It's really quite entertaining. And you're going to find, what it seems to me we learn, is that people begin to look like the things they love and spend time with. Do you spend time with the Lord? Do you spend time daily with the Lord? A little bit each day. If you're thinking, I don't really know how to do that, do I just randomly? No, there's nothing random about it. Couple of suggestions if you're not sure how to do that. Pick a gospel. We've got 4, you know. Pick one. Doesn't matter. Pick one. And have a journal beside you that you like and just start reading. Read a few verses. Doesn't have to be a chapter. Doesn't have to be any set anything. Don't even worry about those little paragraphs that translators have given us. Just read a few verses. When something of Jesus hits you, write it down and stop. Reflect on it through the day. That's one good way. When you get to the end of that gospel, pick another one. Another way is, and I can recommend this to you as well, Beth Moore has a series of books out called Personal Reflection Series. One of those books is on Jesus. The title of it is 90 Days with the One and Only. It's excellent. And it's exactly what it does. For 90 days, it takes you to a small passage and allows you to read her comment, reflect, pray on that little piece, day 1 and then day 2. You have a 90-day plan lined down for you. Pick something. Time with the Lord daily. Number 3, you need to gather a team around you. You know, mountain climbers climb individually, but they have a team. Bike riding, you know that MS 150 bike ride from Houston to Austin? Those riders ride solo, but they have a team. Swimmers swim solo, but they're on a team, because you see, a team is critical for encouragement. A team is critical to help spur you on when you're thinking, I can't do this anymore. A team is there to pick you up when you fall. You got to have a team. You know, in Hebrews again, Hebrews chapter 10, that writer says, let's consider how we can spur one another on. Let's consider how we can encourage one another. It's part of the journey. That's what we do as church. You know that? How I long for that very fact to be the thing that goes into people's minds first when they hear the word church. It's not, you know. In our day and time and in our culture, that is not people's first thought. And it's a shame, because that's what we're there for, to glorify God and to encourage one another. Number 4, don't quit. Don't quit. Hear Paul in Philippians 3:12 when he says, not that I've already obtained this. This is the Apostle Paul talking. Not that I have already reached the goal. What goal, Paul? Transforming into the image of Christ. I haven't already reached the goal, but I press on to make it my own because he has made me his own. I know it's hard, and I know we fail a lot. I know me. And I know there are things we don't understand, but we will not quit. We will get up one more time, and by the grace of God, we will renew our minds one more day, and we will continue the work. My question, do you need to get up again? If so, do it. Use these days of stillness to slowly get up one more time and press on. Finally, number 5. Know this, that God will finish what you cannot do. He's promised it. One of my life verses that I have hung on to for years. It is so meaningful to me. It communicates to me. It holds me. It gives me courage. It encourages me. It comforts me. Philippians 1:6. Hear the words of Paul when he says, I am confident of this. He, God, who began a good work in you, will carry it on to completion. It's a promise. It's a promise. So, my friends, in such a time as this, renew your mind, transforming into the image of Christ. Sometimes the most challenging places to do that are at home with people you are closest with. I'll be praying for you. You be praying for me, that we reflect Christ to each other in these close, intimate settings, that we have the opportunity to be in for some more days. Peace to you, grace from God. I'll see you next week. Bye.